Joy, 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 ever new joy, joy.
Thank you, Devarshi, for taking the time.
Thank you, Dambara. It's a joy to share early times with Ananda, with Swamiji, and yes, thank you.
So speaking of early times, tell me a little bit about your upbringing and where it was and what your family was like.
Okay, that's going back. I grew up in a suburban middle-class family in the suburbs of Chicago. And part of the unusualness of my upbringing that really touched a lot of my life is I have an identical twin brother. And we were very, very close and still are. And we had our own world and our own reality because we were so different from everyone around us, including our family. And we, like some identical twins, we had our own language when we were infants that no one else could understand, that we could clearly understand, and people observing us pointed that out. But we also just had our own reality in many ways, that we were best friends. We, for example, when it was time to go to kindergarten, we refused. We basically said we're not going to school. And it was partly we just didn't fit in this world. We knew right away. And I think I almost feel like God, our gurus, put us together right from the beginning, knowing that we would need another guru bhai with us right from the very beginning, just to get through those early stages of life, because I think we needed that support, because there was always a very extreme sensitivity to other people, to feeling level, on the feeling level, to reality. And so we just really were a big support for each other growing up in that way. Eventually we did have to go to school, but school, church, all these things never really was our purpose in life. I think we always knew that we were out of place in those kinds of situations. We also, something unusual is that on one side of our house was a huge forest preserve. That was just complete natural forest. In India, it would be called a jungle because it was so unkempt and just wild. There was a trail through it, but it went for about 2 miles in all directions. And that was our playground growing up. There was a creek going out there, and we were always catching creatures in the creek and going out in the woods and building forts and climbing trees and swinging on vines. And when I saw the movie, the Jungle Book movie, and would read that book, in some ways it reminded me of our childhood, because we spent so much time out there. And so that forest life actually was very impactful in many ways. I still have such a deep love for trees, and to this day, and I've planted a lot of trees in my life, and I really believe that was given to us as just to help us feel a little bit at home in this world, that it wasn't completely a foreign land. And so that was actually very influential, just I think, for helping us to cope with having to go to school. Because for me, school was always a prison. And we were really good students. We were straight A students, and we were bright and all. So we could navigate our way through that, but it was never home. And it was difficult even finding friends. We had friends, but just we didn't have the same perspective on life that most children did, and we were always looking for more. Church was the same way. We were raised in the Catholic Church, and none of it made sense to us. And the church talked about God, and I had a sense there was something there, but just the formality of it and the rules and the structure never made sense. And an example, and this offends some people, I talked about this once in Ananda, Palo Alto, at this former Catholic church, and someone took a little bit of offense of it. So I say this in a kind way. It was just us, how we grew up. But in the Catholic Church, you would have to go to confession and confess your sins, even as a child. And to us, it was like, we're not sinners. Why are we doing this? And you go in this booth, and it's a dark booth, and there's a shadow of a priest on the other side, and you confess your sins and ask for forgiveness. And And we were children, we weren't sinners. And so we would have to make up sins. Oh, I talked back to my parents and this and that. And the penalty was always the same. Go and say 3 Our Fathers and 3 Hail Marys. And we would race back and see who could get through those prayers the quickest. And it was just, and again, it wasn't disrespectful, it was just none of this reality made sense. But yet we were seeking truth. We were seeking some greater understanding throughout our lives. And right around that time was the whole hippie era. And so this was, by the time we made it to high school, it was the early 1970s. And a lot of revolution and protest, and we were involved in that, protesting the Vietnam War. And yet again, though, we really were foreigners in a strange land, because at our high school, large high school, 1,200 students, we were the only ones protesting. It was just everyone else was very comfortable with it, but we even one day used the school's copying machines to make flyers and stood outside and handed them to people coming out of the school after classes were over to announce a protest where everyone would stay home from school the next day or the day after. It was a nationwide protest against the war. It was called the Moratorium against the war. And I think we were the only ones who stayed home that day. But the fact that we stood up for something that we felt was true, even though no one followed us, it was a really good lesson, because it wasn't like we failed or anything like that. It was just a sense of that we're going alone forward in this life, standing up for what's right. And if people are with us, that's not a problem. We have to stand up for what is true, what we believe is true and right. Mm-hmm. And so that was coming through high school. I don't know that there was more in our younger youth that I can really share, but coming into high school, we also started looking for other higher truth, other realities. It was a time of rejecting everything that our parents had created. We were this whole middle class generation. It's sort of an irony that we grew up comfortably because our parents were successful, and yet we were protesting against them and their generation for what they had created with materialism. So it's a sort of a paradox, but I think a lot of cultures go through this. I see this now in India. I live in India now the last 7 years. And I see this with many of the younger generation, because right now in India there is a large middle class, relatively, coming up for the first time that has been raised in the middle class. And they're questioning what their parents have done, because they see that their parents are not happy. Their parents sought this prosperity or relative comfort, and they got it, and it didn't make them happy. And I think that's kind of where we were coming from, and I see a generation in India starting to think this way. So we were always looking at other alternatives to life. And part of that era was drugs, and we were caught up in that whole era. It was very easily accessible, but it was also a way of trying to realize or understand other states of consciousness. And I think I know that's where we were both coming from, with trying every possible drug. I mean, we experimented with everything we could get our hands on, and and it did open our minds in some ways to the fact that, there are other states of consciousness that can be experienced and understood, and there are much more expansive states of oneness with the universe even that can be understood. And I think for both of us that was just a really wonderful eye-opening and mind-opening thing. And for many people, a lot of our peers and friends, it went down a very, very bad road of just getting caught up in drugs and addiction and all that. And we never really went down that road, because we were looking for truth always. Whatever way we could look, whatever direction we could look, and whether society accepted it or not, or said it was legal or illegal, which, I personally got in trouble with that, with the law, because of that. But it was just, where is truth, and how can I find truth? And by that time we had stopped going to church and being involved with that. But then as part of this whole hippie era, there were starting to be books about yoga and meditation. And this was just in high school that I started really reading those books. And, in that era, there were starting to be, hippies that had done drugs and had these experiences, but then again were wanting more. It wasn't enough, and they went to India and brought back tales and stories of gurus and Indian saints and mystics. And one such teacher was Baba Ramdas, who was an early experimenter with psychedelics, and he went to India and he found his guru, Neem Karoli Baba. And those stories of Neem Karoli Baba were very influential for me, because I read about Neem Karoli Baba, who talked about the saints and the yogis, and it was the first time I had read about yogis. It was like, yogis, this is something that was completely new and completely different for me. And so I began really reading and starting to meditate in high school, and still being involved with the drug scene, because that was always there. But again, this was the transition that I was experiencing and going through with that. And so reading these books, meditating here and there, doing some yoga. And one of the things that really struck me about what I was reading about these saints and gurus is that they talked about an experience of God as divine bliss, as divine joy. And that the Christian saints, the Catholic saints, the yogi saints, they all were talking about and experiencing the same thing. And this is the first time that religion or spirituality ever made any sense to me. Because growing up in the Catholic Church, it's mostly rituals and dogmas, and there's a bumper sticker that I've seen in America that I like to quote because it expresses what many people are comfortable with religion. And it says east or west, but this bumper sticker said, "God said it, I believe it, that settles it." And it's just this, there's a safety in reading, whether it's the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita, and just a safety in knowing that there's a very constrained place of religion and spirituality, and maybe we don't have to change ourselves that much, and maybe in some societal way it provides some structure and moral guidelines. But again, that was never enough for me. And so I kept seeking and looking, and probably praying on some level. I think the deepest prayers are not words. Paramahansa Yoganandaji, he says that I can pray no more with words, but only with wistful yearning of my heart. And I know at that time that there was a lot of wistful yearning of my heart, and I don't know what it was for, because I didn't know what I was seeking, but I knew there was something out there. And I think that wistful yearning that maybe all of us have at one time or another in our lives, in a way I think that's the most profound prayer, because in my own case, I believe God answered that wistful yearning. And so one day I was out walking in this forest behind this house that we grew up in our whole lives, and played so many times and spent so much time in nature and peace, in inwardness. And one day I was walking out there, and I was in a very thoughtful frame of mind. I'd been reading about the yogi saints, and I just had a spontaneous experience of divine bliss that was just overwhelming. And when I had that experience, because I'd been reading these things, I knew at that moment, as I was experiencing it, this is God. This is what the yogi saints, the Christian saints, this is what they are all talking about. This is God that I'm seeking. And I took a vow at that moment. It wasn't even a vow, it was more just an absolute certainty. At that moment, I just said or thought, or maybe just my superconsciousness said, because it wasn't like it was just a thought. But these words were there. It was that I will spend the rest of my life as a yogi seeking God. And there was such a certainty to that, and it turned out that it was a true thought or experience. There was such a certainty that was what I began doing with my life. Everything I did was to become a yogi seeking God. And the very strange thing is that at that point I was, maybe 17 years old. I had never met a yogi in my life. And I didn't know what it meant to be a yogi seeking God. It's not like it's a career choice. If I had gone to my high school guidance counselor, I know what I'm going to do with my career. I'm going to become a yogi seeking God. They probably would have locked me up because it was such a strange thought and a foreign one. But to me, it wasn't foreign. It was just very familiar. Surely it was some scars from past lifetimes. I think my soul put the seed in my consciousness before I was born. And it was, I think, maybe those very words I spoke to my consciousness before, as I jumped into this world from the astral plane and said, I'm going to be a yogi seeking God. And I think maybe we do that. We do an affirmation as we take the leap down into the body and into this world. Maybe we say some words that are going to really guide our lives, because it's just so easy to forget when we are down here. And so this is what really guided my life from that point on.
So Devarshi, I'm intrigued. You talked about your twin brother and how in sync you were. So where was he at during this period?
We went through this journey together, and we have throughout our lives to this very day. We're going through this journey together. And he's become, or has been, a monk in Self-Realization Fellowship for decades, just as I have been here living a life as a renunciate at Ananda Village for many decades. So we continue in that way. But even at that time, we were helping each other, almost like playing leapfrog with each other, with just, each one taking a step and the other one, and following and taking another step. And so we were always helping each other. And we had other friends, but, we realized, I realize now, that they were seeking, but they ended up not really following through on this, brand new reality and way of looking at life that we had understood and experienced, that we were, again, surely committed to from the moment we were born, really.
You also referred to past lives, jumping into this one. And did you ever have any insight, you and your brother, about where you might have been in the past?
I don't dwell much on past lifetimes. I mean, some people do and get readings and all that kind of thing, and I've done a little bit of that. But I just know I've been a yogi in many lifetimes, and those samskars have to be very, very strong to really compel me so early on in this lifetime, because I think I know, meeting many people, even who are living at Ananda Village, that it took them many years and many maybe disappointments as adults and in life and family and business and all these things before they were compelled onto the spiritual path. I know Swami Kriyananda said something one time. He said that souls who have done this a lot in the past, that when they come into this lifetime, it only takes just a little bit of suffering before they are compelled all the way onto the spiritual path. And souls who maybe have not done it as much, maybe they need a lot more suffering and repeated suffering before they start realizing, maybe this isn't the way to go. But souls who have done it, just as soon as there's that hint of suffering, it's, oh yeah, that's right. This is what I came here to do, not that. And that way leads suffering. This way leads to fulfillment and divine fulfillment and soul fulfillment in the end. Yeah. So yeah, I've had glimmerings of past lives as a yogi and maybe in the Himalayas at times, but I've always felt that this lifetime is the one that's important. One of Yogananda's disciples, Sister Gyanamata, was asked, I think, one time about past lifetimes, and she just dismissed it. And she was very Jnana yogi and could be very impersonal, and she just said the only lifetime that's important is this one. This lifetime I'm Gyanamata, I'm a disciple of this great master, Paramahansa Yogananda. And that's a little bit how I felt about it. I haven't dwelled much on the past, but surely my twin brother and I were monks together or something. And I think we even sort of held hands when we jumped down into the abyss of this life and into these bodies and said, okay, we're going together to help each other in many ways. And we continue to do that even many, many, many decades later.
Very special, thank you. So what led from Be Here Now to being here now?
To being here now at Ananda Village. So once I understood that this was my life, I was still in high school, and it was my last year of high school. And just one day, the prison bars of high school and being in the four walls, and just, I think, this memory of all the way back to going to kindergarten, just midway through my senior year of high school, I just walked into the principal's office spontaneously, and I just said to him, I'm done. I just cannot do this anymore. Will you let me go? And can I get my diploma? In those days, people didn't get early graduation. It wasn't just, it wasn't even a thing. But I had enough credits. But I was doing it at an odd time. It wasn't like at a break point in the year. And I just said, I can't do this anymore, and I've had enough. And I think it was the first time I've ever seen that principal of mine smile, because he was so happy to get rid of me. I was such a troublemaker in that high school. It just really, I was a real grief to that principal. I feel bad for some of the things that I did to cause so much trouble, but he was very happy. And he just asked one promise. He said, promise to me that I'll give you your diploma, but you have to commit that you cannot come to the high school graduation ceremony at the end of the year, which is some months ahead. Because he was afraid I would just really cause a lot of trouble and a lot of problems. And I was more than happy. I had no plans. I was done with all of that. So I walked out, and then I went home and I told my parents what I had done. And they were a little bit taken aback by it, but I think they knew me by then. And so I got a job to save enough money to go to California, because I knew I needed to be with yogis. I needed a guru, a teacher, guides, others who were doing this. And at that time in that Chicago area, I mean, I didn't even know how to find a yogi, but I knew that there was this whole scene in California of just this whole counterculture scene that included yogis and possibly spiritual communities and ashrams and the like. And so I just saved enough money with the intention of moving to California, which I did within a year. I moved to San Francisco, and I began seeking. And I didn't know how to seek. There wasn't the internet. You couldn't just go online and use Google and find whatever guru or teacher or ashram. I mean, it was hard to even find these places. It was really mostly word of mouth. And so I would save money and earn money in San Francisco, and then I would spend weeks to a couple months up in the mountains of California. And just my goal was, if I couldn't find my guru, I would live as a hermit. And I was very comfortable just going up into the mountains, the high mountains, and just spending weeks at a time. I'd bring a lot of food back with me, and I would find a remote place to camp off the beaten path up in Yosemite Park and Sequoia Park and in the desert and many other places. And I would just seclude for many weeks at a time. I would eat simply, sleep under the stars, take long walks, read spiritual books, and be very inward. And that was a life I was very comfortable with, being a hermit in the mountains. And I mean, obviously I've done that many, many lifetimes. And it was a very romantic existence in many ways. And just being one with nature. I mean, for me, that forest that I grew up in and being in nature has always held a very strong attraction to me, the simplicity, the quiet of it. I think in some ways I learned how to be still and meditate by fishing as a boy. There was a creek behind our house, and we would go and spend hours fishing together. And the style of fishing that we would do, we would hook a worm, and there'd be a little plastic red and white piece of round called a bobber that would float on the surface, and the line would go under with the worm, and when a fish was starting to nibble, that plastic float would start moving and making ripples. And so you sit there for hours just watching it really closely, looking for those ripples, being very still, not talking. And I think that's how we learned or maybe just reconnected with this idea of complete stillness and quietness and being centered. And so being in nature was very natural for me in a human way and just in a soul way. I'll tell a story about what it was like one morning. I was sleeping, and the only creatures I ever saw, other creatures besides myself, were animals. And I woke up one morning. It was very cold. It was below freezing. The ground was frozen, so I had a very warm sleeping bag. But I didn't have a tent. I was just under the stars, and it was very beautiful because you could just fall asleep and just see the infinite universe above you and just gaze into the infinite. And that was just part of the attraction to me of being a hermit like that. And one morning I woke up, and it was just the top of my head was out of the sleeping bag because it was so cold. And I had very, very long hair, very wild hair that was just not brushed and just like a Baba in the Himalayas in many ways. But I woke up and something was pulling on my hair and just gently tugging and tugging, and I was very curious what it was, of course. I wasn't at all alarmed or frightened. It was some animal, obviously. I hadn't seen humans in a long time. And I woke up and I discovered that there were these two tiny birds that were not just on my hair, but they were inside my hair because my hair was so big and wild, and they were inside my hair, chirping and pulling and playing around. And I think they were either seeing it as a potential nest or material for a nest. And I woke up and just was very joyful just to experience this. And that was what I was experiencing as a hermit. But then I understood that I could try to get as far away from society, and I thought other people and just the world around me was just, it was too much at times, because again, this world has always been very foreign to me. And all the numbers of people and the different consciousness that people have, it was always very challenging for me. Even growing up, it was very difficult. But I realized that as far away as I tried to get from that consciousness and the restlessness, that one person always followed me wherever I went, and that was this Devarshi. Was always there chattering and anxious or caught up in restlessness or desire or attachment. And then I realized I needed to have a sangha, other seekers and other people around me. I couldn't do it on my own. And I also needed a guru. So very soon after that, just within probably a few weeks, I got out of that cold mountain area and went to the desert just to thaw out because it had been so cold. And I did a seclusion in the desert. And two things happened in the desert. One is that I was doing a long fast. And, perhaps initiated by this fast or the heat of the desert or something, but my solitude. But I just had a very intense sort of a vision. And I don't have visions, so this was a very unusual experience for me. But I saw this world going crazy, and the people going crazy, and chaos, and I realized, okay, I need other people of like mind to be around when this world goes through its craziness at some point in the future. And by craziness, I mean really, really crazy, of just whether it's violence or war or cataclysm. But I could feel that something was coming, and I just needed sane people, like-minded people around me. So that's one thing that happened. And the other thing was that just a few days after that, I was hiking in a canyon, and I passed through a camp where there was a young couple camping out. And then about, maybe half a mile past them, I was walking, and there was an altar in the middle of the forest. And I was in very remote places. In fact, it was unusual to see even another person there. And there was a little altar, and there was a photo on that altar. And I looked at that photo, and just, tears came to my eyes because there was a recognition of the face there. I had no idea who it was. I looked at that, and something awakened deep inside me. I didn't go back to find out if it was theirs or who it was. I just kept walking into this deep wilderness, and later I recognized that was Yogananda. It was a photo of him. And so I understood at that time that I needed a guru. And there was an expression that I had read in my readings that I knew to be true, which said that when the disciple is ready, the guru will come to you. And because I had been seeking from a consciousness that probably wasn't ready, I understood that, okay, I need to make myself ready in some way. And so I did two things. One is I decided to go to college. And because I had some financial support, my father had passed away, I was able to get some Social Security money to help fund education. And it wasn't that I was interested in going back to school. It was the last thing I was interested in doing. But I thought this would provide me a way to have stability and to do sadhana. So I would meditate every morning and do sadhana. And I went to California Polytechnic, Cal Poly, in San Luis Obispo to learn agriculture, because I felt, okay, let's learn something that when I do find my community, my guru bhais, let me learn something that's useful and that I'm actually interested in. So I spent about a year doing that. And it was good. I just had a very stable life. And during that time, I also went to, I found, because it was hard to find spiritual centers and retreats, and I was still looking for my path. And I found a place called the Tassajara Zen Center. It's a spiritual retreat near Carmel, up in the mountains there. And I spent about maybe 2 months there as just sort of as a karma yogi, serving there and living there. And right away I realized this is not my path, but I also felt the power of a spiritual fellowship in Sangha, because they had a very strong discipline, where every morning, the same time, the bell would ring, we'd go to the temple, we'd sit inside the temple, and we'd sit for an hour or so of meditation. Very, very still, completely still. And I just had a deep, deep appreciation for the power of group meditation and that kind of support. And I realized, yes, this really is, this is it. This is what I need. But I also realized, but this isn't my path. My heart needs a devotional path, and this maybe isn't my guru, but the experience was really deeply, deeply appreciated. But again, it was very impersonal, especially for myself, who was just much more maybe devotionally inclined. And you would sit in a circle in this big temple, but everyone was facing the wall. And so you would be facing a wall right in front of you. And that was how you meditate. There wasn't an altar, and there would be the guy walking around with a stick, to make sure people were staying awake and everything. And it was a good experience for me, actually. I just really, with delight, I still think of that guy with a stick, formally walking very almost in slow motion around, just holding this bamboo stick up. And every once in a while you would hear a loud whack when he was hitting somebody to wake them up. And he wouldn't hit the guests or the karma yogis. You would have to ask for it. But one day, just, I think for fun, I asked for it. And as he walked by, I pronamed as he walked behind me, and I bent over like this a little bit, and he hit me on the shoulder blades up here with the meaty part of the shoulder with a loud whack. And it was just very joyful because it wasn't painful, but it was like Shaktipat. It was just like this energy. And I understood that there was a truth to that process. It wasn't just some corporal punishment or something, that it really did awaken energy by this force and the way that he did it. But while I was there, the library had some really good books, and there in the library was Autobiography of a Yogi. And I only found it at the very end of my stay, and I just barely started reading it. And I wrote to my twin brother, who was living in Illinois at that time, and I said, you have to read this book. And he did. He actually read the book before I did, because it took me some time to get that book again. And he told me, he wrote back and said, you have to read this book, and the whole book. And so I did. And I was in college around that time, and just, I understood that, yes, this is my guru. I didn't know how to follow him. There was no way to know how to do this. He was dead and all this. And so my twin brother, he somehow, all the way back in Illinois, found out before I could about this place called Ananda Village. And so he visited Ananda Village in 1976 while I was going to college. And he was there when the fire came through Ananda Village. He was in the apprentice program, and he experienced the Ananda fire in its full glory and had a beautiful experience at Ananda. And I was still going to school at the time. And then he visited me after his time at Ananda was finished. And this is a part that it's hard to explain rationally. Maybe other identical twins might understand it. It's just an interesting thing because people sometimes ask me, well, what's it like to have an identical twin? Because it's such a rare thing. And I can only answer by saying, what's it like not to have an identical twin? Because I don't know, I don't have anything to compare it to, because I've always had that and it's just my only reality. And so when he visited me, as soon as I saw him, because we were so close, and I knew him so well, like I know myself, I know him like my own self, but I could see something in him that was new, different, and sort of added on to the person I knew. And it was almost like, and that thing that was added on was Ananda and Yogananda. And it was almost like a brochure for Ananda was what I saw, but on an astral, vibrational way. Again, it's hard to even explain it. But I knew right away, just in seeing that, in a very subtle way, I knew right away, this is my path, this is my guru, this will be my life. And so I applied for the apprentice program at Ananda for the following year. I continued saving up some money and going to college. And just about a month before I was to move to Ananda, I was in a health food store, and I met a high school boy. He was a senior in high school, a local kid. Somehow we got to talking, and I found out that he was a follower, a devotee of Paramahansa Yogananda, and he was meditating, and he was just a delightful, one of the most pure-hearted people I've ever met in my life. His name was Ben, and we just became sort of yogi buddies. We would go off, his family had a cabin up in the hills near San Luis Obispo. We would drive up there and spend days or a week at a time with another friend of his. We would be fasting and meditating all the time, doing the energization exercises, because by then I was taking Yogananda's lessons and following him as my guru and practicing his teachings. I hadn't yet learned Kriya Yoga, but I was meditating every day, following his sadhana. And as I was doing that, it was just a delight. My first spiritual friendship with someone that was very, very deep and very, very pure, and just a lot of joyful time together, doing spiritual discipline and sadhana and these things. And I told him about Ananda Village, this apprentice program, and he also signed up for it. And he graduated from high school, and was a very strange experience because he did a ceremony before he went up there to Ananda Village, and he went up a month before me, and he did a ceremony where he had a fire and he threw in all his identification, driver's license, everything. It was like he was letting go of who he was and just completely letting go. And and it's very interesting because he wasn't like he was a jnana yogi. He was just this pure devotional heart energy person. But it was like I think he had an inkling of what was to come for him. And so he went up to Ananda Village, and about a week before I was to go, someone who knew him came to me where I was living and said that he had died, that he had left the body. And I think maybe he was the first person at Ananda to actually leave the body. And what happened was he was there in the apprentice program, and he had some intestinal blockage or something that got really severe, and by the time they were able to take him to the hospital, he passed away and left the body. And it was just, for me, it was heartbreaking, but it was just also, I was in a state of just seeking God, seeking truth, and by then I was very comfortable with the fact that we are souls, we are not in this body, and we are not who and what we think we are. And just the way that he went about letting go of who he was, I just feel like he had an inkling of what his karma was. And maybe he was preparing for his next lifetime. I remember I had a psychic reading with a woman who's well known in Ananda circles for doing past life readings, and I asked her about this. She said that he was reborn at Ananda to a pair of Ananda parents. And so I believe that maybe that's what he was doing. And in some way it wasn't a deeply emotional loss. I mean, it was obviously on many levels, but it was more food for thought for me to just go forward in this life as a yogi seeking God to the end of life, that no doubt about it, this is what I would be doing. So I came to Ananda Village in the spring, summer of 1977. And even actually before that, I had another experience that I just want to share finally. My last sort of maybe premonition of life at Ananda, which is that I was swimming in the ocean. This story is told in Nayaswami Asha's book, Loved and Protected. It's the third story in that book, so it's easy to find. And I was swimming in the ocean, and it was one of the very first times I'd ever been to the ocean. I didn't know the ocean. I grew up in the Midwest. And yeah, I did see a sign on the way into the water that said, "Dangerous currents, beware." But I didn't know what a dangerous current was. And, I mean, it was the ocean. I mean, how bad could it be? And so I went out into the ocean, I went swimming, and I got caught in a riptide. And a riptide is a extremely strong current that's just overwhelmingly powerful, that when it's that strong, as I experienced it, you cannot fight it. I was only in up to about my thighs, but it was so strong. It just ripped me out to sea. It just pulled me out relentlessly. And I didn't know from riptides what you're supposed to do, so I fought against it. I just kept trying to fight and fight. And the more I fought, and I'm a decent swimmer, but I'm not a great, strong swimmer, but I do know how to swim. But this was just overwhelming. And it just kept pulling me further and further out until finally I was just in crashing waves all over me, and there was nothing I could do. And I reached a point of just really complete exhaustion. There was nothing more I could do. And I literally turned belly up. That expression, I have a newfound appreciation for that expression, turning belly up. I think a fish, when it's going to die, it turns belly up and starts floating. And that's all I could do, was float on my back, because I was so exhausted. And I had no fear. Again, I was in this frame of mind of a yogi seeking God, and this was my life. And I just, I thought I was sure I was going to die. I gave up all hope. I was on my back, and I just offered myself back into God. And I didn't really even know what God was still. I hadn't really understood what God is, but I knew that I was part of this vast universe, and God is divine joy, and I'm part of all this. And so as I was floating on my back, it was a beautiful day. The sky was blue. Here I was in this vast ocean. I mean, how could I not but be at peace and in a great deal of joy at that moment? And I just with complete self-offering, said, "Lord, I'm yours. Take me home." And there was so much freedom. And at that moment, there was also just overwhelming divine bliss. I just got caught up in just extreme oneness with divine joy. And at that moment, I thought, again, I was even more convinced that I was going to be leaving the body, and that, wow, this leaving the body it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And I know you're not supposed to think that thought, but I just was ready to go. And as I was floating on my back, all of a sudden I just found myself in calm water. The waves were not crashing anymore. It was completely calm. And I had somehow, in that calm water floating there, I gained just barely enough strength to actually make my way to shore. In very calm water, it was very easy actually. But when I got to ground, to the beach, I literally just crawled and finally collapsed on the sand because I was so exhausted physically by this. But it really helped me to understand a few things. One of the things I understood from this was that God is divine bliss, and that the way to experience God as divine bliss is simply to give of ourselves, self-offering of ourselves into God, and that the more that we give of ourselves and offer ourselves in service to others, in service to the light, in devotion to God, the little self starts to dissolve, and we start to experience our true self, which is ever new joy. And this is something, again, this goes back to my experience of walking in that forest as a teenager and having this overwhelming experience of divine bliss again. And so when I came to Ananda, divine bliss was my Ishtadevata, as they say in India, your form of God that you worship. And it usually refers to a form of God like Krishna or Kali or Rama, but for me, divine bliss has always been God to me. And so as I read and reread Autobiography of a Yogi over the years, I finally understood and realized that yes, this is what God is. When Yoganandaji had his experience of samadhi, he went to Sri Yukteswarji, his guru, and he said, "When will I find God?" This is after experiencing oneness with the universe. And I think he was just playing games for our sake. I think he was just asking his guru this silly question just to get an answer for us to hear and to read in Autobiography of a Yogi. And, his guru kind of, I think, with a twinkle in his eye and knowing they were playing these roles and playing this game, Sri Yukteswarji just said, "Oh, my child, God is not some old personage with a long beard in some antiseptic corner of the universe." He said, "Ever new joy is God." And it just affirmed for me. And here I came to a place called Ananda, which is the definition of Ananda is ever conscious, ever existing, ever new divine bliss, is the way Yoganandaji described it. And so at Ananda I came, and I was in the apprentice program. And that was just, for me, it was heaven on earth being there. Meditating, having a very strong sadhana, every morning, having long 5-hour meditations every weekend, led by great souls, Ananda souls like Nayaswami Shivani and Prakash and many other people who are still here. And so that was my introduction to Ananda, living very simply, serving in the garden every day with Ananta and Maria, who are still here, or who are back here serving in the garden to this day, having very, very strong sadhana, just, morning, noon, and evening, many hours of meditation on weekends, complete simple living intense. I'm so averse to the four walls of a school or a house or anything. Even then, I didn't live in a tent. We all lived up on the meadow up there by the Temple of Light, that meadow that's up there right now. That was where we all pitched our tents. But I didn't even have a tent. I just had a piece of plastic that I tied a rope between two trees, put this piece of plastic over me with no walls. The plastic was just to keep the rain off of my little sleeping bag. And that was the simplicity of living that we had. The meals were very simple. It was a very low-cost existence. The fire had just come through and burnt down all the houses, and there wasn't a lot of money there. But we lived simply. I remember the cook liked to use a lot of the weeds from the garden as the vegetables every day. And purslane was a particular weed that there was a lot of, and it was like every day. And we were finally rebelled at one point and said, "No more purslane in our stir-fried vegetables. It's just getting too much, and we're tired of this." And it was a lot of those weeds that we were eating. But that was the simple living that we had during that time. But it was very beautiful and just made me, again, affirmed, a yogi seeking God. This is to be my life. And, it's turned out to be such. I just also had many wonderful experiences that affirmed and confirmed that God is divine bliss and divine joy. That's who and what we are. That's what we are made of. And all we have to do is just, again, give of ourselves in meditation, in service, in devotion, especially chanting. And then there were many wonderful experiences during that time. And Prakash was a really beautiful teacher of this art and science of Raja Yoga. And at this point, Swami Kriyananda had not been at Ananda. He was away. He had been traveling. He was working on writing The Path. And I can't remember at that time whether he had been in Hawaii and maybe he had also been to India. But I remember he came back after several months after I had been there. And when he came, I was really surprised on my first meeting with him because I was expecting, in my upbringing, I was expecting saints to be like, there's an expression growing up in Christianity that sort of is a very sentimental feeling that people have about Jesus. And I think it's more of a projection of what people want Jesus to be. But the expression is gentle Jesus, meek and mild. And it would always show Jesus with a baby sheep, petting the sheep. And there's some truth to that, but not the meek and mild part. And because Jesus had power and energy. But I was expecting this yogi saint to come and sit quietly under the tree in the forest and whisper hushed, deep truths that were barely audible, with the birds. And I wasn't expecting someone who had so much energy and dynamic power and singing music and writing books and giving lectures and all these things. And I was really taken aback by that because I thought, wow, this is not what I was expecting from a saint. And I had to know for myself who Swami Kriyananda was. And I knew either that this man is either the biggest egotist I have ever met in my life or he's a great saint. And it was a way for me of just sort of exaggerating the two possibilities so that I could really start to watch him and understand who he was, because I didn't want to take it just because the book said so and other people said so. And so I watched him over the months. And I started to see that, of course, yes, he's the most selfless person, but that the teachings of Yogananda himself was dynamic and powerful. He would run out on the stage before thousands with his hair flying behind his behind him, and he would shout out to these big audiences, "How feels everyone?" And he would have them respond, "Awake and ready." And he had this really powerful dynamism, which God, the power of the universe, is infinite power and infinite creativity and energy. And the joy, divine joy, is not just a sentiment. It's not a meek and mild sentiment. It's overwhelming divine bliss that is awe-inspiring and life-changing and full of energy and full of clarity. And so it took me a while to understand that this is the expression of saintliness. And strangely enough, what finally sort of closed the deal for me of really understanding inwardly, because I had to understand it inwardly in a way. And it was several months later, it was Christmas, and by then I was living in a treehouse. There was no buildings at Ananda. We lived appallingly simply, and I was living in a treehouse. And because there's no houses to live in, by the end of the summer, when the summer warmth went away and it started getting really freezing at night and sometimes snowing, we couldn't just live without walls and without a cover over us. And so I lived in a treehouse, and it sounds very romantic, but this treehouse was, you climbed up a ladder, and there was a platform held between two trees, and it was probably about maybe 10 feet by 6 feet large. But the walls were just clear plastic, but thin, flimsy plastic. that would actually freeze when it got cold. And so it was freezing cold. There was no heat, no water, no nothing. And I got very sick while I was there. I had bronchitis, and I was really struggling with my health because there was no other place to live with warmth or anything, or a house. So I was in that state, and it was Christmas. And I went up to the meditation retreat, and Swami Kriyananda was, of all things, on Christmas Eve, or the day before Christmas, he was reading from P.G. Wodehouse. And it was just very strange. I think partly because of my illness, partly because of just I had never heard of P.G. Wodehouse. What is this he's reading? It's so unusual, but it's hilariously funny. And watching him in his very exuberant state, almost to affirm the one side of, wow, who is this guy? Saints don't behave like this. But I was in an inward and thoughtful state, and a devotional state. It was Christmas. And I just had an overwhelming experience again of just divine joy. And I looked at him, and there was just this aura of light around him that was just palpable, and you could almost touch. It was just so real. And that's when I understood once and for all. And I was getting awareness of it before that, but at that moment I realized, yes, this man is a great saint and a great disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda, and I know this for certain now. So that was my introduction to Swami Kriyananda, and my understanding of him as a disciple of Yogananda, and these early days of Ananda. Again, very simple living, very sweet, just a purity behind it all. If you were to look at Ananda in those days, there was no buildings. Now you see these beautiful houses and buildings here. And the people there was maybe 40 people there who had survived the fire. And these were people who were not very skilled. There was a lot of energy, but there wasn't always a lot of practicality. In fact, just the opposite. But there was a purity of heart. I remember I joined the monastery here soon after that. And soon after I joined, I'd heard that a few of the monks were pooling their resources to buy a car. And this sounds like a practical thing to do, because in the community at that time, there were very few cars. I mean, the householders had cars, some of them, but it was just very difficult just to go to town to do laundry, even, because we didn't have cars. And so a few of the monks were pooling their resources to buy a car. And then I heard the full story, that the car cost $40. Obviously, it was a used car. And the reason why that it cost $40 is because the person who was selling it to them didn't have the title to the car. So I don't know whether it was stolen or whatever was going on with that car. And then I heard the name of the person they were buying it from. And the name of the person was Fast Eddie, was his name. I'm not making this up or exaggerating. And I thought, okay, these guys are buying a car for $40 with no title from Fast Eddie. This is going to be really interesting to watch what happens with this car. And so that night, these monks, a few of them, took the car to town to go to a movie, do laundry, and they hitchhiked back because the car didn't make it back. The car died in town. They left it there and never got it because they didn't have ownership or anything, so they just left this $40 car in town. And this was the type of practicality that you would see sometimes on display. But there was such a sincerity and high energy. It wasn't stupidity, there was high energy. And so if someone were to come, though, to Ananda and look at these people, look at these tree houses and teepees and school buses and such, and think, okay, this is like a startup happening here. This is not going to work. And you could see people going the other way because it just looked so unfeasible. And yet, even in those days, you would hear Swami Kriyananda talking about how Ananda someday would spread all over the world, and we would have teaching centers everywhere, and these teachings would spread like wildfire. And I had a hard time believing that, honestly. I trusted Swamiji, I trusted the people here, but I looked around at these people and how practical they were, and the resources that we had, which were none, and I just didn't see it. I trusted, I wanted to live the rest of my life like this. I was very happy living like that. And now we see Ananda all over the world. And Swamiji saw, he always saw. And it took some of us some time to wake up and start seeing and understanding how Ananda really would find this expression, this expansive, dynamic, creative, energetic, and very powerful expression of these divine teachings of a great avatar, Master Paramhansa Yogananda.
So Devarshi, although you're visiting here at the village, you're currently living in India. So how did that come about?
In 2000, as part of my journey to Ananda, I left the monastery that I was in the very early days and got married. I was married for 25 years to a great soul. Her name was Maria. She had come from the Soviet Union, escaped really in a way the Soviet Union, and came to Ananda, which is a miraculous story in and of itself. And in 2010, she passed away after we were married for about 25 years. And she left the body. And around that time, Swami Kriyananda invited me to come to India. And during that time, I was going through a lot of just extreme health challenges. I was diagnosed with something called Trigeminal Neuralgia, which is the facial nerve that comes from the base of the brain to the face. And just it was causing such overwhelming pain and nausea, dizziness. I was really not even functional much of the time. I tried to go to India. I had a ticket, but I finally had to cancel it because I knew that if I couldn't function here, in a body with all this, then there was no way I could survive in India, which can be challenging in and of itself. So I just knew that the timing would come when I would be able to. And when the fact that Swamiji invited me to do that, I took it seriously. And I wasn't able to do it until even after he had left the body. It took me a few years to finally be able to do this. And so I did. When about 2 years after Swamiji left the body, I finally found my way to India and moved there. This was in 2015. And I spent the last 7 years living in India, serving there, and now serving our monks and developing a monastery in India. So that's how that came about. And just, again, the timing was not right in some ways, but I have a feeling Swamiji knew that he wanted me to live in India, but maybe he knew that the timing wouldn't be till after he left the body. But he had to ask me before because he wouldn't be able to afterwards, and I think he was just planting that seed. He understood that I was going through these challenges with my body, and so there was an acceptance there and a support of that. But the timing finally came, and I was able to move permanently to India in 2015.
I'm intrigued about the pain condition you mentioned. Has that resolved itself to some extent?
It's mostly resolved itself. And that was just one of many really extraordinary lessons in my life, because it was intense and debilitating for about 4 years. And it would come and go, but a couple times a month there would become waves of this where I just couldn't even sit up and meditate and pray or do Hong Sa or any of these things. And all I could do was just talk to God as I was lying there, and sometimes not even able to sleep through the night because of the intensity of the pain. This condition, just so you know, the common name, which doctors don't like because it's such a negative name, but the common name for this is called suicide disease because of the intensity of it. And it was not anything, obviously, that I had ever considered, but it was a way of describing how debilitating this is. So all I could do during these times when it was debilitating was just pray to God as Divine Mother and offer myself to her. And I wouldn't complain. I followed Swami Kriyananda's advice to never pray. He would never pray for himself, and just he would give it all to God, to Divine Mother, which is how he related to God. And so I would just offer myself to Divine Mother, and even this pain and everything I was going through, and I would tease her as my mother and say, look, you created this world, you created me, and you created this. Is this how you treat all your children? Is this the kind of mother you are? And it was said lovingly, and it wasn't like with negativity or anything. But I found that as I offered myself just at her feet, because it's all I could do, I couldn't even sit up and pray, that I found that the more I did that, the more joy I felt. Again, this experience of self-giving, self-offering with love to God equals bliss and equals freedom. And the pain wouldn't go away, but it would recede into the background as this joy would come to the foreground. I've spent many decades working with a program called Photoshop. And one of the things you can do with Photoshop is you can have different images. You can have 2 images that are called layers. And you can take one of the layers and click a little button that says bring forward or send backwards behind the other image. And that's what this was like. It was just the pain would get sent back and the joy would be brought forward. And the pain wouldn't go away, but the joy became more prominent. And I think that was the beginning of the healing of this condition, because, the doctors would say that this is something you'll have for the rest of your life, and for most people it gets worse over a lifetime. And so that was part of the fear and the anxiety of this experience and having that condition. But I found that as I trusted in God and gave my life, and I never stopped serving. I was still traveling around the US doing Kriya initiations as part of my service for the Ananda Kriya Sangha. And at times I could barely function even during that. But I just found that the more I gave, the more I served. I was able to barely function at times, but I was able to keep giving and serving. And again, I found a deep truth that Swamiji said. Someone asked him, what's the most important qualification to be an Ananda minister or teacher? And he said that the most important thing, or maybe a qualification or a sign, is that when going through one's own tests and suffering, even in the worst situations, that one is still thinking about giving to others and serving others. And I found that to be not just a qualification, but a way out of suffering and a way out of pain, is to learn just to give oneself to others, to God, in service to others, no matter what. And this was Swami Kriyananda's example throughout his life. I mean, he certainly did not have an easy life, and he had so many health crises, persecution, challenges, and yet he never stopped giving. It never, even persecution and people attacking him, it never stopped him from giving from his heart still, even though it exposed him to more hurt and more pain and more persecution. But he would never allow other people's treatment of him to change how he would give, and give to God, give to his guru. And so it's the same with pain, suffering, any type of grief and sorrow, because losing my wife was also just, there was a lot of grief and sorrow in that. Of course, it's just part of this human existence and human love and having human relationships it's very real. We can't just ignore that. Or I've seen that people sometimes think, oh, I'm a yogi, I don't have human feelings, or that's not anger I'm feeling. I'm a yogi, and that's not a spiritual feeling, so I'm not feeling it, and people suppress it and push it aside. And I really have seen in my life that God has given us human love and human relationships and grief, hurt, pain, being betrayed, all these things. God gave us this human love, and why? It wasn't just to betray us or to test us. I think it was like a breadcrumb trail to show us that yes, there is something here. Human love can find fulfillment, but not in a personal way, but it leads to divine love. And it's like a breadcrumb trail planting the seed, because why did God give us human parents, children, husband, wife, friends, all these things? And I think it was just to show us the way to go further with this, and not to stop on a human level, but to take it to a divine level and to learn how to turn human love into divine love. But we wouldn't know what love even is or was, except without experiencing it first on a human level. but obviously not to stay there, because we're not going to find complete fulfillment only in human love and human relationships. But it doesn't mean that they're not good. Yogananda said we can't win God's love without winning the love of our fellow human beings. So there is a truth to these human relationships, and a seed planted by God, again, just to show us the way, and to show us how to love, and how to love unconditionally then, and how to experience and feel that, and then how to learn to develop that divine love as part of this process. And too many yogis, they think, oh, this is all delusion, and human love is a delusion, and this and that. And on one level it is, if we only think we'll find fulfillment only in that level. But in another way it isn't, because it too came from God. And that's been my experience of this progression from learning divine love through human love, and not staying on that level of only human love, but learning to transcend, and learning just to go through it, and learning to go higher into it, into the divine through that.
Devarshi ji, will you share with us about what is happening in India with the monks?
Sure. When I moved to India, I was serving in a couple different ways in our center in Gurgaon near Delhi. And then after a couple of years, I was asked to just come and direct our monks in India and work with developing a monastery. And we'd had fits and starts with the monastery in India. And the one who was leading at that point, Brahmachari Jamal, who's back co-leading it with me, he was taking a year of seclusion and time away. And so I moved to Pune, which is a city in India, and we had about 5 monks there. And it was trying to form a new core of monastery. And it was very difficult to do in the context of a center that was very vibrant, and a lot of different poles in different directions. And to make a long story short, the early days of Ananda, we had a very dynamic monastery with monks and nuns, a convent. And it was so dynamic and so magnetic that it was difficult for the householders, because the monks and nuns were able to meditate long hours, they were free to serve, and there was a strong magnetism that they had because of that. And the householders, almost, on a subtle level, it wasn't overt, or wasn't any like persecution or anything. It was almost like they were sort of second-class yogis in a way, because they just weren't able to do as much, obviously, and they had their own dharma. And yet, Swami Kriyananda came to start World Brotherhood colonies that was going to be especially for people raising families, and more reaching out to many, many people rather than just those who could be hermits, like was my inclination. And so those early monasteries, it was not Ananda's future at that time to be a monastic community. And so those monasteries, Swami Kriyananda, through his own actions and getting married in his own life, it sort of dissolved this monk and nun energy. And really, Ananda then really flourished as a householder community, with businesses, with schools, with music, with arts, with families. And it was much more for the whole world, not just for people who could come and be a monk and a nun living in a treehouse, because we were not going to reach very many people. It was not going to spread like wildfire. That was just for those people. And so it wasn't the time to develop monasteries. And Swamiji said that, but it was always something that was very important to him. And so over the years, there was many fits and starts to try to get some monks and nuns together at times, and it never really was magnetic or worked very well. Swamiji himself didn't give hardly any energy to it. And so when we were there trying to develop the magnetism of the monks in Pune, it wasn't working very well. And I really prayed a lot to Swamiji, how do you want us to do this? I mean, there have been a lot of, I wouldn't call them failed monasteries, in Ananda's history, but a lot of them have dissolved and dissipated. And I didn't want to see that happen again. And I just really prayed deeply to Swamiji and to Master, to Yogananda, what do you want us to do here? Because this isn't working. And there's not a strong magnetism because there's too many different pulls in different directions. And then I read a booklet that Swamiji wrote when he was in SRF called Give Me Thy Heart. And the way I found that book was Swamiji wrote a book in 2005 called The Story Behind the Story. And it's about all the books that he wrote in his life. And I was surprised, like everyone else, to see this little booklet that he mentioned in SRF that he had written, which SRF still shares that book, but they won't say who wrote it. And they probably don't believe that Swami Kriyananda wrote it, but he tells the story of writing it. And he says, and this book is still very important to me, and I want Ananda to adopt this when the timing is right. And that light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, let's see if the timing is right to really form a really true, more traditional in some ways type of monastery, the way that Swamiji described it in this booklet. And so that's what we've been doing in India. And as we've been doing it, we have found a lot of success with attracting a new kind of a monk, with creating a really strong core monastic community, because a monastery is a community of monks. And we have some really good sort of solo monks who are, being monks and being central leaders in India and living more on their own. But Swamiji said he wanted a monastery in this very, strong way, again, when the timing is right. And so that's what we've been forming in India, and me working closely with Brahmachari Jamal and others of some longer time Indian monks. We've been really forming this. We bought some land up in the north near Chandigarh last year, and we're just barely starting to build some cottages or kutirs, as they are called in India, because Swamiji said he didn't want his monks in India living under one roof. He wanted them living in cottages so that they would have time just for them and God, but he also wanted them to be meditating every day as a group and having group meditations, meals together, serving together in a work that was just the monks doing together. And so it's more of in some ways, a traditional monastery without the rigid rules, but with this strong cohesive force of just this monks all as one for all, going forward together. It's kind of like I describe it as team monks, and it's like a team sport in a way. And some great athletes are very good with individual sports. They're better at golf or tennis and being a star in that way. And some are much more inclined for team athletics and being part of a very cohesive team. And so a monastery is sort of like team monks in a way. And so it's a different type of monk, and there's also great monks who are doing more of this individual thing. But the timing seems to be right, because we're starting to attract more of this monastic community type of monk, and it's starting to really grow. And the energy is really strong, and these guys are doing great things, because the purpose wasn't to run away from the world and be hermits like my early experiences before coming to Ananda. And these guys are spreading the teachings through their online classes and through the Hindi Sangha in India and the Kriya Sangha. So they're very dynamically active and creative with spreading the teachings. But Swamiji wrote that, he said that imagine if our monks could have such intense yearning for God and such intense love for God. He said, imagine if they could have the same love that Yogananda had as a child, when he would hear the name of Divine Mother and he would start weeping. Just hearing the name of Divine Mother would cause him to weep for intense love and yearning for God. He said, imagine if our monks had that yearning. Imagine the great things that they could do to spread these teachings and to spread inspiration and to spread this great work that we've been given to spread and to share with the world. And so that's been kind of part of the motivating, driving energy behind this, is creating an environment of a monastic community that supports a deeply inspired inner life, an intense yearning for God and inwardness that will provide the energy and the fire to spread Yogananda's teachings from a sense of inspiration and love for God and a degree of self-realization, rather than just being a good talker or a good lecturer, but being a really good, intense devotee and lover of God. Because that's what's going to change the world, is that grace, that love. Yes, also with the teachings of Raja Yoga and meditation that Yogananda ji gave to us. And so this is what our monastery is doing, and it's proving itself to be a really very, very successful model. And Swami Kriyananda didn't come to start a monastery. He came to start these World Brotherhood colonies. But he always said, someday, he said it was really important to him that we have a very strong monastery again, or really for the first time, because really, this is really, so far it's knock on wood, but it is the beginning of something that I think will, and maybe already is, the most successful monastic community approach that we've ever taken with Ananda. So that's what I'm doing in India now, and let's see how the future goes. There's a lot of promise and potential, and I believe that Yogananda, Swamiji are sending us the right monks to do this too, and that also, I think, confirms for me that yes, it does seem that the timing is right for this.
How do people connect with you if they want to do that or support your efforts there?
We have our monks in India. We're still trying to raise money to buy a little bit more land and to start building the buildings. We own 4.5 acres, and we're just starting this process. And they can contact me through Ananda India, my email, devarshi@anandaindia.org, or just go to contact anyone at Ananda India and find out how to get in touch with our India monks. But prayers especially are really very helpful for this. And let's see what the future holds for it. Because we have a core of new monks there that are different. It's a different energy and just a very unique and very positive thing. And again, I just think that Yogananda is starting to say, okay, now you're getting this right, and now I can start sending you the right people here. I wasn't going to send you to them before because our monks would all end up, or many of them would end up getting married or not being fulfilled in this type of life that we were trying to, in the training that we were doing, because training is a big part of it, of just training a new way of thinking and a new way of life. So,
Devarshi, I appreciate your time. Are there any final thoughts that come to mind that you'd like to share?
With Ananda in India, it's just growing leaps and bounds everywhere. And I think we're just really just at the beginning stages of seeing this great work that was brought by Paramahansa Yogananda through his disciple Swami Kriyananda really start to take off in the world. Many people, when Swami Kriyananda left the body, many people would say, and people would ask me, they would say that when the founder of a great work leaves the body, that it usually starts to dwindle and fade away. And they said, well, is that going to happen to Ananda? And they were assuming that it would. And I said, no, it's not going to happen here, because Swamiji empowered and trained people to do as he did in his life, to really be an instrument for God, to be an instrument for these great masters of self-realization. And that's a divine power that we all can be part of, to be instruments for. And so the future of Ananda is really great. And not great in the sense of worldly success, but just great in the sense of inspiring others to give their lives to God, to find divine freedom, to yearn for God, to self-offer every part of their being to God as these great avatars, our line of gurus, to Divine Mother. And that really is Ananda's work. And as that can spread through the world, this world needs light. There's a lot of darkness in this world. And the more light that each one of us can spread and be an instrument for, in a very positive, proactive, dynamic way, this is what's going to change the world. And this is why we came, I believe. And it wasn't just as a yogi seeking God for himself. I realize now, I thought that was the idea when I first had that call, but as a yogi seeking God, to be part of this great movement of many people seeking God and helping others to seek God, to know God and to find God.